The morning sun peeked through the tall glass windows of Atlanta's busiest airport, casting long golden streaks across the polished floors. Travelers hurried in every direction, some dragging suitcases, others clutching coffee cups, a few trying to calm fussy toddlers. It was just another Tuesday, the kind of day that blends into the rhythm of routine for most people. But for Dr. Amara Okoro, this Tuesday would become anything but ordinary. Amara stood near gate B14, checking her boarding pass one last time. She wore a simple navy blue blazer over a cream blouse, her locks neatly tied back, and a well-worn leather satchel slung across her shoulder. Inside that satchel were notes from a 3-day public health conference she'd just attended, discussions on vaccine equity, community outreach strategies, and how to better serve underserved populations during health crises. She'd spoken on a panel the day before, and though she wasn't one for spotlight, her quiet authority had drawn nods of respect from colleagues across the country. She wasn't flying for leisure. She was heading back to Los Angeles, where she worked as an epidemiologist with a nonprofit focused on closing gaps in healthcare access. Her flight, Delta 218, was scheduled to depart at 9:15 a.m., and she'd arrived early, as she always did. Punctuality wasn't just a habit. It was part of how she moved through the world, thoughtful, prepared, and respectful of others' time. As she waited, she scrolled through messages on her phone. Her younger sister had sent a photo of their niece's first day of preschool. Tiny backpack, big smile, mismatched socks. Amara smiled. She typed back a quick, "She's adorable," before slipping the phone into her pocket. Around her, the usual airport hum continued. Announcements over the loudspeaker. The clatter of rolling luggage, the occasional laugh from a group of friends reuniting before a trip. Boarding began right on time. Business class passengers were called first, and Amara walked down the jet bridge with the calm assurance of someone who'd done this dozens of times. She found her window seat, 12A, and settled in, stowing her satchel under the seat in front of her. The cabin smelled faintly of cleaning solution and coffee. A flight attendant greeted her with a warm, "Good morning," and Amara returned the smile. She buckled her seatbelt, adjusted the air vent above her, and pulled out a paperback novel she'd been meaning to finish. Everything felt normal, routine, safe. Then, about 10 minutes before takeoff, something shifted. A flight attendant approached her row, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. "Ma'am," she said softly, "could you please come with me for a moment?" Amara blinked. "Is everything okay?" "It's just a quick verification," the attendant said, though her eyes flickered toward the cockpit. "Standard procedure," Amara hesitated. She'd never been pulled off a plane before, but she didn't argue. She stood, smoothed her blazer, and followed the attendant down the aisle. Passengers glanced up, some curious, others indifferent. At the front of the cabin near the galley, another crew member waited, speaking quietly into a headset. "Your name is Dr. Amara Okoro," he asked. "Yes." "Thank you for your patience," he said, though his tone lacked warmth. "We need you to step off the aircraft temporarily while we resolve a security matter." Amara's stomach tightened. "A security matter? What kind of matter?" "I can't go into details," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "But it's required." She looked past him toward the cockpit door. It was slightly ajar. Inside, she caught a glimpse of a man in a pilot's uniform, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, talking urgently into a radio. He turned slightly, and for a split second their eyes met. His expression wasn't angry. It was something colder, resolve, certainty, as if he'd already made a decision she had no part in. Back on the jet bridge, airport security waited. They didn't handcuff her or search her. They simply escorted her to a small holding area near the gate, where a supervisor explained, again vaguely, that there had been a concern about a passenger matching her description. No specifics. No evidence. Just concern. Amara sat on a plastic chair, arms crossed, heart pounding. She wasn't scared for her safety. She was hurt, humiliated, because deep down she knew this wasn't about a tip or a threat. It was about her skin, her hair, the way she occupied space without apology. Around her, other passengers boarded the plane, casting sideways glances. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked away quickly, as if her presence might somehow taint them too. One woman clutched her child closer as she passed. Amara kept her head high, but inside, a familiar ache settled in her chest. the kind that comes from being treated like a problem simply for existing. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Captain Elias Voss stood firm. He'd been flying commercial jets for 23 years. He prided himself on safety, discipline, and instinct. When he'd reviewed the passenger manifest that morning, something about Dr. Okoro's name and photo triggered a reaction he couldn't explain. He later claimed he'd received an unverified alert through a private aviation security channel, a claim that would later be proven false. But in that moment, his gut told him, "I don't feel safe with her on board." He called operations. "I cannot operate this flight with that passenger," he said, voice low but firm. The operations manager was stunned. "Elias, are you sure?" "She's a doctor, no record. Nothing flagged." "I'm not comfortable," Voss replied. "That's all I need." And so the decision was made, not by policy, not by proof, but by discomfort. Back at the gate, Amara was finally told she wouldn't be allowed to reboard. The airline offered to rebook her on the next flight, 4 hours later, and gave her a voucher for a meal. No apology, no real explanation, just logistics. She called her father. General Nnamdi Okoro answered on the second ring. He was in his garden, pruning his hibiscus bushes, the morning sun warm on his back. When Amara told him what happened, he didn't yell. He didn't sigh dramatically. He just went very quiet. "Did they say why?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I know why." He exhaled slowly. "You did nothing wrong, Amara." "I know," she whispered. "But it still hurts." At that moment, Delta Flight 218 pushed back from the gate, without her. The engines roared to life and the plane taxied toward the runway. Inside, passengers settled in, unaware that the woman who should have been in seat 12A was now sitting alone in a sterile airport corner, trying to hold back tears. What no one realized, not the crew, not the passengers, not even Captain Voss, was that the woman they'd just excluded was the daughter of a man who had once shaped the very safety systems protecting every person on that aircraft. General Okoro had served as a senior advisor to the FAA after 9/11, helping redesign cockpit protocols, passenger screening standards, and crew response procedures. He'd worked tirelessly to ensure that fear never overrode facts. And now, decades later, his own child was being removed from a flight based on nothing but a pilot's unease. Amara stayed at the airport for hours. She watched planes take off and land, each one carrying people who would never question their right to be there. She thought about all the time she'd been followed in stores, questioned at conferences, or mistaken for staff instead of a speaker. This wasn't new, but it was different. This time it was public. It was official. It was sanctioned by an institution. When she finally boarded the later flight, she chose a middle seat in economy, far from the business class cabin that had rejected her. She didn't speak to anyone. She stared out the window as the plane climbed into the sky, the city shrinking below. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself feel the weight of it all, not just the injustice, but the exhaustion of having to prove again and again that she belonged. What happened that morning could have ended there. Just another quiet humiliation swallowed and forgotten. But sometimes the universe has a way of turning small moments into turning points. And in the days that followed, a single video filmed by a passenger who'd witnessed Amara being escorted off would ignite a firestorm that no one saw coming. But that's a story for another time. For now, on that ordinary Tuesday, all Amara knew was the sting of being told, without words, that her presence was a risk, and the quiet, unshakable truth that she hadn't done a single thing wrong. The video surfaced late that same night. It was shaky, filmed on a phone from a few rows back. Just a few seconds of grainy footage showing a woman in a navy blazer being asked to leave her seat by a flight attendant, her expression calm but confused. The audio was muffled, but you could hear someone off camera say, "Is this because she's black?" Followed by silence. The clip ended there. No one knew who posted it first. Maybe it was the college student in 15C who'd been scrolling TikTok during boarding. Maybe it was the retired teacher in 10F who'd felt uneasy but didn't know what to do. Whoever it was, they didn't tag anyone or add commentary. Just the raw clip uploaded with the caption, "This happened on Delta 218 this morning." She didn't do anything. By midnight, it had been shared over 20,000 times. By dawn, it had a hashtag, "Who is Amara Okoro?" At first, people just wanted to know who she was. Was she a celebrity? An activist? someone with a history, but as journalists dug deeper, the truth painted a different picture. Dr. Amara Okoro wasn't famous. She wasn't controversial. She was a public health expert who spent her days analyzing disease patterns in low-income neighborhoods and designing programs to get vaccines to people who needed them most. Her LinkedIn showed conference talks, research papers, and volunteer work at free clinics. Her social media was mostly photos of her niece, sunsets from hiking trips, and occasional posts about Nigerian jollof rice. She was, in every measurable way, an ordinary professional, except for the fact that she'd just been removed from a plane for no clear reason. News outlets began calling. Local stations in Atlanta reached out first, then national networks. Amara didn't answer most calls. She was still in Los Angeles unpacking her suitcase in her quiet apartment near Koreatown, trying to shake off the fatigue of travel and the heavier weight of what had happened. But on the third day, she agreed to a short interview with a reporter from a respected public radio station. She didn't want to make a spectacle. She just wanted people to understand what it felt like to be treated like a threat when you've done nothing wrong. "I wasn't angry in the moment," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I was confused, then embarrassed, then sad, because I've worked hard to be where I am. I've earned my seat on that plane, literally and figuratively. And yet someone looked at me and decided I didn't belong." She didn't accuse the pilot by name. She didn't demand punishment. She simply told her truth, and that honesty resonated. Over the next 48 hours, the story exploded. Civil rights organizations issued statements. Former flight attendants shared their own experiences of bias in the industry. Aviation unions distanced themselves from the pilot's actions while calling for due process. Delta released a carefully worded press release saying they were reviewing the incident and committed to inclusive service, but the public wasn't satisfied. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. Behind the scenes, the airline was in crisis mode. Executives held emergency calls. Legal teams pored over cockpit communications and passenger logs. What they found troubled them. There was no security alert linked to Amara Okoro. No flagged name. No tip from any official source. The only record was Captain Elias Voss's verbal request to remove her, based, he later claimed, on a gut feeling and an unverified concern he'd heard through an informal pilot network. But when investigators asked for proof of that concern, Voss couldn't produce it. No message, no email, no log entry, just a feeling. Meanwhile, Amara tried to return to her routine. She attended a virtual meeting with colleagues in Nairobi about maternal health outreach. She picked up her niece from school. She cooked a goosey soup for dinner, the rich aroma filling her kitchen like a hug, but her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in, from strangers thanking her for speaking up, from other Black professionals sharing their own stories of being questioned, followed, or excluded in spaces where they'd earned their place. One message stood out. It was from a young woman in Houston, a first-year medical student. She wrote, "I saw your interview. I've been scared to apply for research fellowships because I feel like I'll always be seen as less than. But you reminded me that my presence is valid. Thank you." Amara read that message 3 times. Then she cried, not from pain this time, but from the strange, heavy responsibility of realizing her experience wasn't just hers alone. It belonged to so many others, what almost no one knew, not the media, not the public, not even Amara's closest friends, was that her father had once held one of the most trusted roles in U.S. aviation safety. General Nnamdi Okoro hadn't just served in the military. After the 9/11 attacks, he'd been called out of retirement to help rebuild the nation's air travel security framework. He'd worked alongside FAA officials, airline executives, and intelligence experts to design protocols that balanced safety with fairness. He believed deeply that security shouldn't come at the cost of dignity. He'd even helped draft guidelines about when a pilot could legally refuse a passenger, rules that required documented threats, not hunches. And now, decades later, those very rules had been ignored by a man flying under the system General Okoro helped create. Back in Maryland, the general watched the news unfold with quiet intensity. He didn't post on social media. He didn't call reporters. But every evening he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of ginger tea, reading every article, listening to every clip of his daughter's voice. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly when he saw the video of her being let off the plane. He remembered the day she got her doctorate. She'd worn a bright yellow geal and hugged him so tight he thought his ribs might crack. "You taught me to speak truth even when my voice shakes," she'd whispered. Now her voice hadn't shaken, but someone else's fear had drowned it out. Still, the general waited. He wasn't a man of impulsive action. He believed in strategy, in timing, in letting the right moment reveal itself. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Because while the world was focused on Amara, and the airline scrambled to contain the fallout, something else was happening, something quieter but just as powerful. People were talking. Not just online, but in break rooms, in classrooms, in airport lounges. They were asking questions like, would this have happened if she were white? What gives one person the power to decide who belongs? And who watches the watchers? Even some pilots began speaking out. A retired captain from Chicago wrote an op-ed saying, "A gut feeling isn't protocol. It's prejudice dressed in a uniform." Another, a young woman flying for a regional carrier, tweeted, "I've been told I don't look like a pilot more times than I can count." Now imagine being told you don't belong on a plane just for sitting in your seat. The conversation was shifting, from one incident to a whole system, and then, on the 5th day, Delta made its move. They announced that Captain Voss had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. They apologized to Dr. Okoro for the distress caused. They pledged to review all policies related to passenger removals. It sounded like progress, but Amara wasn't celebrating. She knew apologies could be performative. Policies could gather dust. Real change required more than statements. It required people in power to truly see what had happened and why. That evening, she called her father. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm tired," she admitted. "But I'm not backing down." There was a long pause. Then he said, "Good." She could hear the pride in his voice and something else, resolve. "What are you thinking, Dad?" He didn't answer right away. Outside his window, fireflies blinked in the dusk. "I'm thinking," he finally said, "that sometimes the people who build the walls forget who they were meant to protect." Amara didn't know it yet, but her father was already planning his next move. He wasn't going to write a letter. He wasn't going to give an interview. He was going to walk into Delta's headquarters in uniform and ask the people at the top a simple question. Is this what we built aviation safety for? But that would come soon enough. For now, the world kept watching. The hashtags kept trending. And Amara kept living her life, answering emails, tucking her niece in at night, and wondering if her story would fade like so many others. Or if just maybe it would be the spark that changed, something real. What she didn't know was that her father's quiet walk into that corporate office would do more than demand accountability. It would force an entire industry to look in the mirror, and sometimes that's where change begins, not with a shout, but with a single step taken in full uniform, full honor, and full truth. The morning General Nnamdi Okoro decided to act. The air in Maryland carried the first crisp hint of autumn. He woke before sunrise, as he always did, and made his tea. Ginger, strong, no sugar. He sat on his porch for a long while, watching the sky lighten from deep indigo to soft gold. His hands rested on his knees, steady now, no longer trembling like they had the night he first saw the video of his daughter being let off that plane. He didn't rush. He never did. But today he dressed with purpose. He pulled on his dress uniform, the one with the navy jacket, brass buttons, and rows of medals earned over 30 years of service. Not for show, not for drama, but because this uniform meant something. It wasn't just fabric and metal. It was a record of duty, of sacrifice, of trust placed in him by a nation during its most uncertain hours. And if he was going to speak to those who ran one of the country's largest airlines, he would do so, not as a grieving father, but as a man who had helped shape the very system they now seemed to have forgotten. He drove himself to the train station, briefcase in hand. Inside it, a printed copy of the FAA safety guidelines he'd co-authored in 2003, a letter from Amara's childhood teacher praising her integrity, and a single photo of her in her doctoral robe. He didn't need them, but he wanted to carry them, like armor made of memory. By mid-morning, he stood at the sleek glass entrance of Delta's corporate headquarters in Atlanta. The building rose like a polished blade against the skyline, modern, imposing, efficient. Security guards in crisp navy blazers stood at the doors, scanning badges, checking IDs. When the general approached, they didn't recognize him, but they saw the uniform, saw the medals, saw the way he carried himself, not with arrogance, but with quiet authority that demanded respect. "Can I help you, sir?" one asked. "I'd like to see the CEO," the general said simply. The guard blinked. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," the general replied, "but I think he'll want to see me." He gave his name. At first, the receptionist on the intercom sounded skeptical, but then someone in the back, maybe an older executive who remembered the post-9/11 aviation reforms, gasped softly. Within minutes, a senior vice president came down himself, tie slightly crooked, eyes wide. "General Okoro? Sir, we didn't expect you." "I know," the general said, "but here I am." They ushered him into a private conference room on the 18th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture, a bottle of water already waiting. He didn't sit right away. He walked to the window and looked out over the city. Somewhere down there was the airport. Somewhere on that tarmac was the gate where his daughter had been told she didn't belong. When the CEO finally entered, flanked by 2 advisors and a legal counsel, the general turned. He didn't shake hands. He just looked the man in the eye. "You removed my daughter from a flight," he said, "not because she broke a rule, not because she posed a threat, but because your pilot felt uncomfortable." The CEO opened his mouth to speak, but the general held up a hand. "I'm not here for apologies," he continued, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here for clarity, because I helped write the rules that allow a pilot to refuse a passenger, and those rules require evidence, not feelings, not rumors, facts." He placed the 2003 FAA guideline document on the table. Section 4.2, paragraph B. A crew member may request passenger removal only in the presence of credible, articulable threat indicators verified through official channels. There was no such indicator in my daughter's case. Yet she was removed. Why? Silence filled the room. The legal counsel shifted in his seat. The CEO cleared his throat. "We're conducting a full investigation, General. Captain Voss claims he received a tip," the general interrupted gently. "There's no record of it. No log, no timestamp. Just a story told after the fact to justify an action already taken." He paused, then added, "Let me ask you something. If my daughter had been a white woman with blonde hair and a southern accent, would he have felt the same discomfort?" No one answered. The general didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the room like a held breath. "I didn't build this system so that fear could override fairness," he said. "After 9/11, we were terrified. We made mistakes, but we also learned. We said security must be smart. It must be fair. It must not become a weapon against the very people it's meant to protect. And now, 20 years later, my daughter, a doctor, a citizen, a human being, is treated like a suspect because she boarded a plane looking like herself." He finally sat down. "Not in anger, in sorrow. I'm not asking you to fire a man," he said. "I'm asking you to ask yourselves, what kind of culture allows this to happen? And what are you willing to do to change it?" The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then the CEO leaned forward. "What would you have us do, General?" The general looked at him. "First, tell the truth publicly. Admit that this wasn't about security. It was about bias. Second, involve people like my daughter not just as victims but as partners in redesigning your training. Third, remember that every passenger on your planes has a story, and none of them should have to prove they deserve to be there." Before he left, the CEO asked if he'd be willing to speak at an upcoming industry safety summit. The general considered it. Then he nodded. "But not about racism," he said. "I'll speak about trust. About how safety without integrity is just theater." That afternoon, news of the general's visit leaked, not through press releases but through whispers in the aviation world. Pilots, flight attendants, even baggage handlers began talking. Some were defensive, others ashamed. A few admitted they'd seen similar things happen but stayed silent, not wanting to rock the boat. But something had shifted. The story was no longer just about one woman on one flight. It was about legacy, about who gets to decide who belongs, and about the quiet courage of a father who wore his uniform not to demand special treatment, but to remind an entire industry of its own promises. Back in Los Angeles, Amara got a call from her father that evening. "I went to see them," he said. She didn't ask who. She already knew. "What did they say?" "They listened," he replied. "Whether they'll act is another matter." "But they listened," she closed her eyes. "Thank you, Dad." "For what?" "I only said what needed saying, but Amara knew better." Her father had done more than speak. He'd stood in that room as both a soldier and a parent, as a man who had given his life to a system, only to find it failing his child. And instead of walking away, he'd walked right into the heart of it, not with rage, but with dignity. Over the next few days, Delta issued a new statement. This one was different. It didn't hide behind ongoing investigations. It acknowledged that Dr. Okoro's removal did not meet established safety protocols and that implicit bias may have played a role. They announced mandatory anti-bias training for all flight crews, developed in partnership with civil rights experts, and they invited Amara to join a new advisory council on equity in air travel. She accepted, but with conditions. She wouldn't be a token. She wouldn't smile for photos while real change stalled. She wanted the training to be honest, uncomfortable, and ongoing. She wanted pilots to hear stories like hers, not as accusations, but as mirrors. Meanwhile, the general prepared for his speech at the safety summit. He didn't write it on a computer. He wrote it by hand late at night at his kitchen table. He spoke not of blame, but of responsibility, of how even the best systems can rot from the inside if no one tends to their soul. And when the day came, he stood before hundreds of aviation professionals, pilots, engineers, regulators, and said something simple. The sky doesn't see color. It doesn't care about your uniform, your title, or your fears. It only asks one thing, that we fly with honor. And honor means seeing people, not just passengers. Afterward, several pilots approached him. One, a young man with tired eyes, said, "My instructor once told me, if something feels off, trust your gut. But what if your gut is wrong because it's been trained to fear the wrong things?" The general put a hand on his shoulder. "Then you retrain it. Not with shame, with awareness." That conversation, small, human, real, was the beginning of something, not a fix, not a finale, but a turn. Because real change rarely comes from headlines. It comes from moments like this. A father in a uniform, a daughter who refused to stay silent, and a room full of people finally willing to ask, "What if I've been wrong?" And sometimes that's enough to reroute an entire industry. The changes didn't happen overnight, but they began to take root faster than anyone expected. Within weeks of General Okoro's visit to Delta's headquarters, the airline rolled out its first round of mandatory anti-bias training for flight crews. It wasn't the usual slideshow with stock photos and vague platitudes. This was different. Amara worked closely with a team of psychologists, former flight attendants, and civil rights educators to design sessions that felt real, raw even. Pilots and crew members sat in small groups, not in lecture halls, and talked about moments they'd felt uneasy about a passenger. Then they dug deeper. Why? What triggered that feeling? Was it behavior or appearance? One session included a recording of Amara's voice, not from a news clip, but from a private conversation she'd allowed them to use. "I wasn't loud," she said in the audio. "I wasn't disruptive. I just existed." And somehow that was enough to make someone feel unsafe. A veteran captain later admitted that hearing those words hit him harder than any policy document ever could. "It made me realize," he said quietly during a debrief, "that I've probably made assumptions too. Not out of hate, just habit." That honesty became the seed of something new. Meanwhile, the Department of Transportation wrapped up its investigation. Captain Elias Voss was officially suspended without pay. Internal records revealed he'd been involved in 2 other incidents over the past 3 years, where passengers of color were questioned or removed under similarly vague justifications. Each time, complaints had been filed but quietly closed with no policy violation found. Now, with public scrutiny and internal pressure, Delta had no choice but to act. Voss chose early retirement rather than face a formal disciplinary hearing. He never issued a public statement. But months later, in a sealed letter sent only to Amara, never shared with the press, he wrote, "I let fear speak louder than facts. I failed you and I failed my oath." Amara read the letter once. Then she tucked it into a drawer and didn't look at it again. Not out of bitterness, but because some apologies aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be lessons carried forward. As the weeks turned into months, the ripple effects spread beyond Delta. Other major airlines quietly reviewed their own removal protocols. The FAA announced it would update its guidance on implicit bias in cockpit decision-making, a direct nod to the Okoro case. Even flight schools began adding modules on cultural awareness and emotional intelligence to their curriculums. One instructor in Oklahoma started each class with a simple question: who do you picture when you think of a passenger who doesn't belong? And why? But the most unexpected shift happened in the air itself. Passengers began noticing small changes. Flight attendants made more eye contact. Pilots introduced themselves over the intercom with warmth, not just routine. On one Delta flight from Chicago to Seattle, a young black man in a hoodie was offered a complimentary upgrade to business class, not as a token gesture, but because the lead attendant remembered how often people like him were watched, questioned, or ignored. "Just wanted you to feel seen," she told him with a smile. Back in Los Angeles, Amara kept working. She didn't become an activist overnight. She still spent her days analyzing health data, writing grant proposals, and mentoring students. But now she also sat on that advisory council, pushing for real accountability, not just training but follow-up evaluations, anonymous reporting channels for crew members who witness bias, and transparency in how passenger removals are reviewed. She turned down most media requests. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be a bridge. Her father, meanwhile, returned to his quiet life in Maryland, but not before accepting a new role: guest lecturer at the National Test Pilot School in California. There he spoke to future aviation leaders not about engines or navigation, but about judgment. "Your instruments can tell you your altitude," he told a room of wide-eyed trainees. "But only your character can tell you whether you're flying with integrity." One student asked him if he thought the industry could truly change. "I don't know," the general replied. "But I do know this: systems don't change themselves, people do. And sometimes it only takes one moment, one person being treated unfairly, for a whole room to finally open their eyes." That same month, Amara received an unexpected invitation. Delta asked if she'd be willing to observe a routine flight, not as a passenger but from the jump seat in the cockpit. It was a rare honor, usually reserved for aviation professionals or inspectors. She hesitated. The memory of being escorted off that plane was still tender. But then she thought of her niece, who'd recently told her teacher, "My aunt flies planes in her mind so others can fly safely in real life." She said yes. The morning of the flight, she arrived at LAX in simple slacks and a soft gray sweater. No blazer this time. Captain Lena Ruiz greeted her at the gate. Ruiz was one of the first Latina women to command a major U.S. commercial route, and she'd been vocal about the need for inclusion in the cockpit. "I've wanted to meet you for months," she said, shaking Amara's hand firmly. "Not because of what happened, but because of how you chose to respond." As the plane taxied down the runway, Amara sat just behind the pilots, listening to their calm, precise communication with air traffic control. The sky opened up above them, vast and indifferent to human drama. She watched the city shrink below, freeways like silver threads, buildings like scattered toys, and felt something unexpected: peace. Not because the pain had vanished, but because she'd helped turn it into something useful. Later, at a small gathering after the flight, Ruiz asked Amara what she hoped would come next. "I don't need monuments," Amara said, stirring her tea. "I just want a world where a girl like my niece can board a plane wearing her natural hair, carrying her dreams, and never once wonder if she'll be told she doesn't belong." Ruiz nodded. "Then we keep flying, and we keep changing the sky." Back home, Amara started writing again, not reports but letters, to the young medical student in Houston, to the retired teacher who'd filmed the original video, to the flight attendant who'd whispered "I'm sorry" as she led her off the plane. She didn't ask for anything. She just said thank you for speaking up, for bearing witness, for not looking away. And slowly, others began writing back. A pilot in Denver shared how he'd challenged a colleague's assumption about a Middle Eastern passenger. A gate agent in Miami described how she now double-checks her own reactions before calling security. A teenager in Atlanta sent a drawing of a woman with locks sitting proudly in a cockpit with the words, "One day, that's me." None of it erased what happened, but it built something new on top of the wound. Months later, at a public forum on transportation equity, Amara was asked if she felt vindicated. She paused. "Vindication sounds like an ending," she said. "This isn't an ending. It's a beginning. Real change isn't about one person getting justice. It's about making sure the next person doesn't have to fight the same battle." The room fell silent. Then someone started clapping. Soon the whole audience was on their feet. Not for her, but for the idea she represented. That dignity is not a privilege. It's a right. And it belongs to everyone, no matter what they look like or where they sit on a plane. As she left the stage, her phone buzzed. It was her father. Just 2 words. "Well done," she smiled. No grand speeches. No fanfare. Just those 2 words from the man who taught her that courage isn't loud. It's consistent. And in that moment, she knew the work would continue. Not with anger, but with care. Not for applause, but for the quiet certainty that every person deserves. To move through the world without having to prove they belong. Because the sky is wide enough for all of us. We just have to learn to share it. A year after the incident, Delta Flight 218 took off from Atlanta once again. Same route, same morning light, same gate. But this time, everything was different. Dr. Amara Okoro sat in the jump seat just behind the cockpit, not as a passenger under suspicion, but as an invited observer. The plane hummed with the familiar rhythm of engines and airflow, but the atmosphere inside felt lighter, as if the aircraft itself had exhaled a long-held breath. Captain Lena Ruiz, calm and focused, ran through her pre-flight checklist with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of earning your place in a space that once told you didn't belong. Amara watched the ground fall away through the small cockpit window. The city shrank into a patchwork of roads and rooftops, then vanished beneath a blanket of clouds. She thought of that morning a year ago. The confusion, the shame, the quiet fury of being treated like a threat for simply existing. Now she was here, not to prove anything, but to witness what healing could look like in motion. It wasn't perfect. Change never is. But it was real. In the months since, the ripple had grown into a wave. The training program Amara helped design was now used by 3 major airlines. Flight academies across the country had added ethics modules that included her story. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a case study in how bias can slip into even the most technical decisions. The FAA had updated its guidance, requiring airlines to document and review every passenger removal, with an emphasis on identifying patterns of discrimination. But the most meaningful shifts weren't in policy, they were in people. Young flight attendant in Dallas started a peer support group, where crew members could talk openly about moments they'd second-guessed their own reactions. A retired air marshal in Chicago began mentoring new security trainees, teaching them to distinguish between actual risk and unconscious fear. Even passengers noticed the difference. Less side-eye, fewer hushed whispers, more genuine smiles. Amara didn't take credit for any of it. She knew she was just one thread in a much larger tapestry. But she also knew that sometimes one thread is enough to start the weave. Her work in public health continued, but now it carried a new dimension. She began speaking at medical and aviation conferences alike, always circling back to the same idea, that systems built on exclusion, even unintentionally, fail everyone. Healthcare, air travel, education, they're all human systems, she'd say. And if we don't tend to the humanity in them, they become machines that grind people down instead of lifting them up. Her father, back in Maryland, had returned to his garden. But he wasn't quite the same quiet retiree he'd been before. He still pruned his hibiscus bushes and sipped ginger tea at dawn. But now he also spent afternoons on Zoom calls with aviation students, sharing stories not just about protocols, but about principle. He never mentioned his daughter by name in those talks, but everyone knew. One evening, over a video call, Amara asked him if he ever regretted stepping into Delta's headquarters that day. He chuckled softly. Regret? No. I only wish I'd done it sooner for others who didn't have a father in a uniform to speak for them. She understood. That was the heart of it, wasn't it? Not revenge. Not spotlight. But responsibility. Meanwhile, Captain Elias Voss had disappeared from public view. He moved to a small town in Montana, bought a cabin near a lake, and spent his days fishing and reading history books. He never flew again. Friends said he was quieter now, more reflective. He donated anonymously to a scholarship fund for young pilots of color, a detail only revealed years later in a footnote of a local newspaper. Amara never sought him out. She didn't need closure from him. Her peace came from knowing that his choice hadn't defined her story. It had launched it into something bigger. Back in Los Angeles, life settled into a new rhythm. Amara's niece started second grade and declared she wanted to be a pilot, like Auntie Amara's friend Lena. Amara smiled and bought her a model airplane kit. They built it together on the kitchen table, glue on their fingers, laughter filling the room. One Saturday morning, as they painted the tiny wings silver, the girl looked up and asked, "Did people really not want you on the plane?" Amara paused. She could have softened it, but she believed in truth even when it's hard. "Yes," she said gently. "Some people were afraid of me just because of how I looked. Were you mad?" "I was sad," Amara admitted. "But then I decided to help make sure it wouldn't happen to someone else." The girl nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Good," she said, dipping her brush back into the paint. "Because everyone should get to fly." And in that moment, Amara knew the work was worth it, not for headlines or apologies, but for this, a child who couldn't imagine a world where someone like her aunt wouldn't belong in the sky. As the year turned, the story of Flight 218 became part of something larger. It was included in ethics textbooks at universities. It was referenced in congressional hearings about transportation equity. But more quietly, it lived in the choices people made every day. Like a gate agent who double-checked a passenger's ID with kindness instead of suspicion, or a pilot who paused before acting on a gut feeling and asked, "Is this really about safety or something else?" Amara never became famous. She didn't want to be. She preferred the quiet impact of real change, the kind that happens in hallways, cockpits and classrooms, not just on screens. Still, once a year, on the anniversary of that flight, she allowed herself a small ritual. She'd go to the airport not to fly, but just to sit in a terminal and watch people come and go. She'd see families reuniting, students heading off to college, elders traveling to see grandchildren, and she'd remind herself this is why it matters. Because travel isn't just about moving from one place to another, it's about belonging everywhere you go. On the second anniversary, Delta invited her to speak at their annual safety summit. She accepted, but only if she could share the stage with Captain Ruiz and a young flight attendant named Tariq, who had spoken up when he saw a passenger being unfairly questioned on his first solo flight. Together, they didn't talk about blame. They talked about responsibility, about how safety and dignity aren't opposites, they're partners. Afterward, an older pilot approached Amara. His eyes were wet. "I flew for 30 years, he said, and I never once thought about how my assumptions might hurt someone. Thank you for helping me see." She simply nodded. "Thank you for being willing to look." That night, she called her father. "I think we did okay," she said. "We did more than okay," he replied. "We reminded people that honor isn't in the uniform. It's in the choice." And maybe that was the truest ending of all, not a grand finale, but a quiet continuation. Because the sky doesn't care about your skin, your name, or your story. It only asks that you treat it and everyone in it with respect. Amara still flies. Sometimes for work, sometimes just to feel the clouds beneath her. And every time she buckles into her seat, she takes a deep breath. Not out of fear, but out of gratitude. Gratitude for the people who stood with her, for the systems that bent toward fairness, for the little girl who believes she too can soar. And most of all, for the truth that no one should ever have to prove they deserve to be where they've already earned the right to be. The plane climbs higher. The world falls away, and for a moment there's only peace, wide open and shared by all.